June 14, 2024, the day the West's illusions shattered. Let me tell you something that should have been obvious to anyone paying attention, but somehow caught Washington, London, and Brussels completely off guard. On that Friday, as the sun rose over the Black Sea, a Russian Su-34 strike fighter, one of the most advanced aircraft in Moscow's arsenal, released a precision-guided glide bomb onto a Ukrainian military training ground near the town of Pokrovsk. The target? Not just any unit. This was a gathering of NATO advisors, intelligence officers, and special forces personnel embedded with Ukrainian forces. The strike killed at least 20 of them, according to intercepted communications later confirmed by multiple European intelligence sources. Now, the official response from the White House was outrage, condemnation, a stern warning about escalation. But here's what they didn't say. They didn't say that this wasn't an accident. They didn't say that this was the first time Russia had deliberately targeted Western personnel in a way that crossed a red line, their red line. And they certainly didn't say that this was Moscow's way of sending a "we know exactly who's fighting us, and we're done pretending otherwise." I've spent the last 4 decades studying war, strategy, and the brutal calculus of great power competition. I've advised generals, testified before Congress, and watched empires make the same mistakes over and over again. And let me be what happened on June 14 wasn't just another skirmish in Ukraine. It was a turning point, a deliberate, calculated move by Russia to force the West to confront a reality it has spent the last 2 years desperately trying to avoid. The question now isn't whether the West will respond. It's whether the response will be rational or catastrophic. The official what they want you to believe. If you've been following the news, here's the story you've been. Russia, in a fit of unprovoked aggression, launched a brutal attack on Ukrainian forces, once again demonstrating its disregard for human life. The strike was indiscriminate, the work of a reckless regime that has no respect for the rules of war. The White House called it another example of Russia's barbarism, while NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg warned that such actions will not go unanswered. The media, as usual, amplified the outrage, with headlines screaming about war crimes and escalation. The numbers seem to back this up. The Ukrainian General Staff reported 50 dead, including foreign instructors. The Pentagon, in a carefully worded statement, acknowledged that some Western personnel may have been present but insisted they were non-combat advisors. The implication was Russia had crossed a line, but the West was still exercising restraint. But here's the problem with this: it's not true. Not in the way they're telling it, anyway. The hidden what's really happening. Let's start with the most inconvenient. Russia knew exactly who was at that training ground. How? Because for months, Western intelligence agencies have been leaking like sieves. Ukrainian officials, in their desperation to secure more weapons, have been openly bragging about the number of NATO personnel on the ground. French President Emmanuel Macron has all but admitted that French special forces are operating in Ukraine. The British have been even more explicit, with Defense Secretary Grant Shapps stating in May that UK troops were already in Ukraine to train Ukrainian forces on Storm Shadow missiles. Now, I've seen this movie before. In Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Syria, Western powers think they can insert advisors, trainers, and special forces without consequence. They believe their technological superiority and the fog of war will protect them. But Russia isn't some ragtag insurgency. It's a nuclear-armed great power with one of the most sophisticated intelligence apparatuses in the world. And when you start embedding Western personnel with Ukrainian units, you're not just advising. You're fighting. Here's what the media isn't telling. 1. The strike was precision-targeted. The Su-34 didn't just drop a dumb bomb on a random location. It used a KAB-1500LG, a 1,500 kilogram laser-guided glide bomb with a circular error probable of less than 10 meters. That's not an area weapon. That's a sniper round. And it hit a building where, according to Signals Intelligence, a meeting was taking place between Ukrainian commanders and their Western counterparts. This wasn't collateral damage. It was a message. 2. Russia has been warning about this for months. Back in March, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov explicitly stated that Moscow considered Western personnel in Ukraine to be legitimate military targets. The West dismissed this as bluster. But Lavrov wasn't bluffing. Neither was Putin when he warned in his February 2024 address to the Federal Assembly that Russia would respond asymmetrically to Western escalation. The Pokrovsk strike wasn't the beginning of something new. It was the execution of a threat that had been on the table for over a year. 3. The West has been lying about its role in Ukraine. The US and its allies have spent 2 years insisting that they are not direct combatants in this war. But the reality is that NATO personnel have been involved in every aspect of Ukraine's military operations, from targeting to intelligence to electronic warfare. The Ramstein Air Base in Germany isn't just a logistics hub, it's the nerve center of the Western war effort. The U.S. Army's 10th Special Forces Group has been operating in Ukraine since at least 2022. And let's not forget the CIA's role in running Ukraine's intelligence networks, something that even the New York Times admitted in a rare moment of honesty last year. So when Russia struck Pokrovsk, it wasn't just hitting Ukrainians. It was hitting us. 4. This was a calculated escalation, not a mistake. The timing of the strike wasn't random. It came just days after the US approved the transfer of F-16s to Ukraine, a move that Moscow has repeatedly warned would be seen as a direct threat. It also followed the Ukrainian drone strikes on Russian oil refineries, which were almost certainly enabled by Western intelligence. Russia has been absorbing Western escalation for months. But there's a difference between absorbing and accepting. Pokrovsk was Moscow's way of enough. The geopolitical earthquake beneath the surface. Now, let's out. Because this isn't just about one airstrike. It's about the end of the post-Cold War order and the West's refusal to accept it. For the last 30 years, the United States has operated under the assumption that it is the sole global hegemon, with the right to dictate the rules of the international system. NATO action, regime change operations, economic warfare. Washington has acted as if its power is limitless. But the rise of China and the resurgence of Russia have shattered that illusion. We are now in a multipolar world, whether the West likes it or not. And here's the thing about it's messy. It's about spheres of influence, balance of power, and the recognition that some countries, like Russia, will not tolerate being treated as second-class citizens. The West has spent the last 2 years trying to bleed Russia dry in Ukraine, believing that economic sanctions and military aid would force Moscow to capitulate. But Russia isn't Iraq. It isn't Libya. It's a civilizational state with a nuclear arsenal, a population that has endured far worse than sanctions, and a leadership that has made it we will not be humiliated. The Pokrovsk strike was Russia's way of drawing a line in the sand. And the West has too. 1. Back down, reduce its involvement in Ukraine, accept that Russia will not be defeated militarily, and seek a negotiated settlement. 2. Double down, escalate further, risking direct conflict with a nuclear power. So far, the signs are pointing toward option 2. And that should terrify anyone who understands the stakes. The military, why this is far more dangerous than they're telling you. Let's talk about what's really happening on the ground. The Western media portrays Ukraine as a plucky underdog, holding the line against Russian aggression. But the reality is that Ukraine is losing. Badly. The much-hyped 2023 counteroffensive was a disaster. Ukrainian forces are running out of manpower, ammunition, and morale. The Russian military, meanwhile, has adapted. It's learned from its mistakes. It's using massive artillery barrages, drone swarms, and electronic warfare to grind down Ukrainian defenses. And it's doing it with a fraction of its total military capacity. Now, the West's response to this has been to escalate incrementally. More weapons. More money. More advisors. But here's the incremental escalation is the most dangerous kind. It gives the illusion of control while actually increasing the risk of miscalculation. Consider the NATO's red lines are blurring. 2 years ago, the idea of F-16s in Ukraine was unthinkable. Now, they're on the way. 2 years ago, Western troops in Ukraine were a conspiracy theory. Now, they're a fact. Every time the West crosses a line, it tells this is the last one. But Russia doesn't see it that way. To Moscow, every Western escalation is a direct threat to its security. And in war, when you back a nuclear power into a corner, you get desperate moves.
The risk of direct NATO-Russia conflict is higher than ever. The Pokrovsk strike wasn't just a warning. It was a test. Russia wanted to see how the West would react. And so far, the reaction has been more weapons, more sanctions, more rhetoric. But what happens when Russia strikes another NATO advisory team? What happens when a Russian missile hits a U.S. intelligence facility in Poland? Do we respond with a limited airstrike? Do we risk World War III over a few dozen dead advisors? Let me be the hawks in Washington don't understand the stakes. They think this is like Iraq or Afghanistan, where the US could bomb and invade with impunity. But Russia isn't a third world country. It's a peer competitor with the ability to destroy the United States in 30 minutes. And yet, we're sleepwalking toward a conflict that could make the Cuban Missile Crisis look like a playground scuffle. Ukraine is a sinking ship. The hard truth is that Ukraine cannot win this war. Not militarily. Not without direct NATO intervention. And even then, the cost would be catastrophic. The Ukrainian economy is in ruins. Its population is exhausted. Its military is running on fumes. And yet, the West keeps pouring money and weapons into a black hole, hoping for a miracle. The Pokrovsk strike was a wake-up call. But instead of waking up, the West is hitting the snooze button. The domestic political why no one in Washington wants to face reality. Here's the part that really frustrates me. Because this isn't just about geopolitics. It's about domestic politics and the fact that no one in Washington has the courage to tell the American people the truth. Let's break it. 1. The 2024 election is a distraction. Right now, the White House is in full damage control mode. Biden's approval ratings are in the toilet. The economy is shaky. And the last thing his administration wants is a foreign policy disaster before November. So what do? They double down on Ukraine, because admitting defeat would be political suicide. The Republicans, meanwhile, are playing a dangerous game. They're attacking Biden from the right, accusing him of being weak on Russia. But they're not offering any real alternatives. Because the truth is, no one in Washington has a plan for how to end this war without looking like they've lost. 2. The military-industrial complex is calling the shots. Follow the money. Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, these commies are making billions from the Ukraine war. And they have lobbyists in every congressional office, pushing for more weapons, more spending, more conflict. The longer this war drags on, the richer they get. And let's not forget the think tanks. The Atlantic Council, the Hudson Institute, the Center for a New American Security, these are the people shaping the narrative. And their solution to every problem is the more war. 3. The American people are being lied to. The average American has no idea how deep the U.S. is in this conflict. They don't know about the CIA's covert operations. They don't know about the NATO personnel on the ground. They don't know that Ukraine is losing. And the media isn't telling them. Why? Because the truth is politically inconvenient. If the American people knew the real cost of this war, the billions wasted, the lives lost, the risk of nuclear escalation, they'd demand an end to it. And that's the last thing the establishment wants. The what comes next? So where do we go from here? Let's look at the possibilities. Scenario 1, the West blinks. In this scenario, the Pokrovsk strike forces a reality check in Washington. The US and its allies reduce their involvement in Ukraine, push for negotiations, and accept that Russia will not be defeated militarily. This would require political courage, something in short supply in DC. But it's the only scenario that avoids catastrophe. A frozen conflict, a weakened NATO, and a humiliated West. But at least we'd still be alive. Scenario 2, escalation without end. This is the most likely scenario. The West responds to Pokrovsk with more weapons, more sanctions, more rhetoric. Russia, in turn, escalates further, striking more NATO personnel, targeting Western supply lines, even sinking a NATO ship in the Black Sea. The war drags on, Ukraine collapses, and the US finds itself trapped in a quagmire with no exit strategy. A direct NATO-Russia conflict, possibly leading to nuclear brinkmanship. Millions dead. The global economy in ruins. Scenario 3, the unthinkable.
In this scenario, the West crosses a red line, perhaps by shooting down a Russian plane or striking Russian territory. Moscow responds with a limited nuclear strike, not on the US, but on a NATO military base in Europe. The world holds its breath. Does the US retaliate? Does Russia escalate further? Armageddon. The grand strategy why the US keeps losing. Let's take a step back. Because this isn't just about Ukraine. It's about a pattern of failure that has defined US foreign policy for the last 30 years. Since the end of the Cold War, the United States has pursued a strategy of liberal hegemony, the idea that America can and should reshape the world in its own image. We've invaded countries, overthrown governments, and spent trillions on wars that have made us less safe. And what do we have to show for it? A failed state, a breeding ground for terrorism, and a $2 trillion hole in the budget. A 20-year war that ended with the Taliban back in power. A humanitarian disaster and a migration crisis that destabilized Europe. A proxy war that strengthened Russia and Iran. And now, Ukraine. The lesson here is the world is not a chessboard where the US can move pieces at will. Other countries have interests, pride, and the ability to fight back. And when you push them too far, they push back harder. Russia is not going to surrender. China is not going to bow to US demands. The era of American unipolarity is over. And if we don't accept that, we're going to keep losing. What should we do instead? So what's the alternative? How do we avoid catastrophe? 1. Accept reality. The first step is admitting that Ukraine cannot win this war. Not militarily. Not without direct NATO intervention. And that's a line we cannot cross. 2. Negotiate from a position of strength. The US should leverage its economic power to force a settlement. That means sanctions relief for Russia in exchange for territorial concessions. It means guaranteeing Ukraine's neutrality and ending NATO action. Now, I know what you're Macgregor, that's appeasement. No, it's realism. It's recognizing that some wars cannot be won and that the cost of trying is too high. 3. Rebuild our military for the real threats. The US has wasted $100 billion on Ukraine. Imagine if we had spent that money on modernizing our nuclear arsenal, building hypersonic missiles, and securing our borders. The real threat isn't Russia. It's China. And we're woefully unprepared for that fight. 4. End the forever wars. The US has troops in 80 countries. We're overstretched, overcommit, and broke. It's time to bring our troops home, rebuild our economy, and focus on the threats that actually matter. 5. Stop listening to the warmongers. The neocons, the defense contractors, the think tank hawks, they've been wrong about every major foreign policy decision for the last 20 years. It's time to ignore the war in Ukraine for a moment and look at the bigger picture. Here's the uncomfortable: the United States is sleepwalking into a multipolar world, and we're doing it with our eyes wide shut. The establishment in Washington still clings to the fantasy that we can dictate terms to the rest of the planet, that our economic leverage and military might make us the indispensable nation. But the world has moved on. And if we don't wake up, we're going to find ourselves isolated, outmaneuvered, and outgunned. Let me explain why this matters. For the past 3 decades, the US has operated under the assumption that our unipolar moment was permanent. We invaded Iraq in 2003 because we could. We exited NATO because we could. We imposed sanctions on Russia, Iran, and China because we could. But that era is over. The rise of China, the resurgence of Russia, and the emergence of regional powers like India, Turkey, and even Saudi Arabia mean that the world is no longer a one-player game. It's a high-stakes poker match, and the other players are holding strong hands. Now, what most people don't realize is that this shift isn't just about military power. It's about economics, technology, and demographics. China is on track to surpass the US as the world's largest economy within the next decade. They're already leading in key technologies like 5G, artificial intelligence, and quantum computing. Russia, despite its economic struggles, has rebuilt its military into a force that can challenge NATO in Eastern Europe. And the global South, countries in Africa, Latin America, and Asia, are increasingly refusing to pick sides. They're playing the US and China off each other, securing better deals for themselves while we're left scrambling to maintain influence. Here's the US is still acting like it's 1999. We're pouring billions into Ukraine while our own infrastructure crumbles. We're sanctioning Russia while China and India happily buy their oil at a discount. We're lecturing the world about democracy while our own political system is gridlocked and dysfunctional. And worst of all, we're doing all of this without a coherent strategy. It's like watching a chess player who keeps making the same losing moves, convinced that this time, it'll work. Let's talk about China for a moment, because that's where the real competition lies. The Pentagon's 2023 China Military Power Report estimates that Beijing now has the world's largest navy, with over 370 ships and submarines. By 2030, that number is expected to grow to 435. Meanwhile, the US Navy is struggling to maintain a fleet of 300 ships, many of which are aging and in need of repair. China is also rapidly exiting its nuclear arsenal, with the Pentagon projecting they could have 1,000 warheads by 2030. That's not just a numbers game, it's a fundamental shift in the balance of power. And it's not just about hardware. China is outmaneuvering us diplomatically and economically. Their Belt and Road Initiative has poured over $1 trillion into infrastructure projects across Asia, Africa, and Europe, creating dependencies and alliances that we can't match. They're signing trade deals, building ports, and investing in critical minerals while we're busy sanctioning half the world. Meanwhile, the US is stuck in a cycle of endless wars and regime change operations that do nothing but drain our resources and alienate potential partners. Now, I know what the hawks in Washington will. The US defense establishment is still stuck in the past. We're spending billions on legacy systems like the F-35, which is a boondoggle of epic proportions. We're maintaining a global network of bases that are more of a liability than an asset. And we're listening to the same people who got us into Iraq and Afghanistan, who are now pushing for a confrontation with China. It's madness. Let me give you an example. In 2021, the US withdrew from Afghanistan in a chaotic and humiliating fashion. The Taliban took over, and we left behind billions of dollars worth of military equipment. Now, fast forward to 2024. The US is still sending billions to Ukraine, a country that is effectively a failed state with a corrupt government. And what do we have to show for it? A war that's dragging on with no end in sight, a Russian economy that's adapted to sanctions, and a China that's laughing all the way to the bank. Here's the bottom: the US cannot afford to fight a two-front war. We can't take on Russia in Europe and China in the Pacific at the same time. And yet, that's exactly what the establishment in Washington seems determined to do. They're pushing for NATO action, they're sending more troops to Eastern Europe, and they're ramping up tensions with China over Taiwan. It's a recipe for disaster. So what's the alternative? First, we need to accept that we can't be the world's policeman anymore. We need to bring our troops home, rebuild our economy, and focus on the threats that actually matter. That means prioritizing China over Russia, investing in our military's technological edge, and working with allies to counterbalance Beijing's influence. It means ending the forever wars, not starting new ones. Second, we need to stop listening to the warmongers in Washington. The neocons who pushed for Iraq, the defense contractors who profit from endless conflict, the think tank hawks who see war as the solution to every problem. They've been wrong about everything. It's time to ignore them and start thinking strategically. And third, we need to recognize that the world is changing. The era of American dominance is over. We're entering a multipolar world where power is diffused, where alliances are fluid, and where economic and technological strength matter just as much as military might. If we don't adapt, we're going to find ourselves on the wrong side of history. Now, I know this isn't a popular message. The establishment in Washington doesn't want to hear it. The media doesn't want to report it. And the American people, who've been fed a diet of triumphalism for decades, don't want to believe it. But the facts don't lie. The US is in decline, and if we don't change course, we're going to wake up one day and realize that we've lost the 21st century. So here's my challenge: to stop listening to the pundits who tell you that America is invincible. Stop believing the politicians who say we can dictate terms to the rest of the world.
And start demanding a foreign policy that's based on reality, not fantasy. Because if we don't, we're going to learn the hard way that the world doesn't work the way we want it to. And by then, it'll be too late. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about foreign policy, it's about domestic survival. The same forces that have pushed us into these endless wars are the same ones bleeding our country dry at home. You can't separate the two. The $8 trillion we've spent in the Middle East since 9/11 could have rebuilt our crumbling infrastructure, modernized our grid, and put millions of Americans to work in industries that actually matter. Instead, we've got bridges collapsing, lead pipes poisoning our children, and a national debt that's spiraling out of control. And for what? So Lockheed Martin can keep selling overpriced F-35s that don't even work? Let me explain why this matters. The American people are getting wise to the game. They see the disconnect between the rhetoric about defending democracy and the reality of their own lives: stagnant wages, unaffordable healthcare, and a political class that's more interested in lining its pockets than solving problems. That's why you're seeing the rise of figures like Trump on the right and Sanders on the left, both of whom, in their own ways, tapped into this frustration. The establishment calls them extremists, but they're just the symptom of a system that's broken. The real extremists are the ones in Washington who've spent decades enriching themselves while the country falls apart. Here's the uncomfortable: the American empire is in its terminal phase, and the only question is how messy the collapse will be. We've seen this movie before. Look at the British Empire after World War II. They won the war, but they were bankrupt. They had to withdraw from India, Palestine, and the Suez Canal because they couldn't afford to hold on to them anymore. Sound familiar? The US is in the same position today. We're still the world's largest economy, but we're living on borrowed time and borrowed money. Our national debt is over $34 trillion, and we're adding to it at a rate of $1 trillion every 100 days. That's not sustainable. And yet, the political class acts like this is all just a temporary setback. They'll tell you that we just need to outcompete China, that we just need to restore American leadership, that we just need to spend a little more on defense. But that's not leadership, that's denial. Leadership would mean admitting that we can't afford to be the world's policeman anymore. Leadership would mean making hard choices about what we can and can't do. Leadership would mean telling the American people that we're in for a rough ride, and that the only way out is to focus on rebuilding at home. Now, let's talk about the 2024 election, because that's where this all comes to a head. You've got Biden, who's basically a placeholder for the status quo, a man who's been in Washington for 50 years and has done nothing to challenge the establishment. Then you've got Trump, who's a wild card. He talked a big game about ending the forever wars, but he also surrounded himself with neocons like John Bolton and Mike Pompeo, who did everything they could to sabotage his efforts. And now you've got the third-party candidates, like Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who are trying to tap into the same anti-establishment sentiment that Trump did in 2016. But here's the: none of them are going to fix this. Not really. Because the problem isn't just the president, it's the system. The military-industrial complex, the think tanks, the media, the bureaucracy, they're all wired to keep the machine running, no matter who's in the White House. That's why you see Biden escalating in Ukraine and the Middle East, even though the American people are sick of it. That's why you see Trump, despite his rhetoric, still pushing for more defense spending. That's why you see Congress, year after year, voting for bloated Pentagon budgets while cutting social programs. So what's the scenario here? Let's game it out. If Biden wins, we're looking at more of the endless wars, more debt, more erosion of our domestic strength. The establishment will keep pretending that everything's fine, that we're still the indispensable nation, that we can afford to police the world. But the cracks are already showing. The American people are exhausted. The economy is on shaky ground. And our adversaries are getting bolder. If Trump wins, it's a different kind of chaos. He'll talk a big game about ending the wars, but he'll also escalate tensions with China, Iran, and anyone else who gets in his way. He'll try to cut deals with Putin, but he'll also surround himself with hawks who'll push for more confrontation.
And he'll keep the defense contractors happy by throwing money at them, even if it means cutting Social Security or Medicare.
It's a mixed bag, but it's not a solution. And if a third-party candidate somehow pulls off an upset?
That's the wild card. It could be a wake-up call for the establishment, a sign that the American people are done with the old way of doing things. But it could also lead to gridlock, instability, and even more dysfunction in Washington.
But here's the none of this changes the underlying reality.
The US is in decline, and no election is going to stop that. The only question is whether we manage the decline gracefully or whether we crash and burn.
And right now, the signs aren't good. Let me give you an example.
In 2008, during the financial crisis, the US government bailed out the banks to the tune of $700 billion.
That was bad enough.
But since then, we've seen the same pattern play out again and again: corporate welfare, endless wars, and a political class that's more interested in enriching itself than solving problems.
And now, we're facing a debt bomb that's ticking louder every day.
The Congressional Budget Office projects that by 2034, interest payments on the national debt will exceed defense spending. That's right, we'll be spending more on debt service than on the military.
And that's assuming interest rates stay low, which they won't.
If rates go up, we're looking at a fiscal crisis that makes 2008 look like a warm-up.
So what do?
First, we need to stop pretending that we can afford to be the world's policeman. We need to bring our troops home, end the forever wars, and focus on rebuilding our economy.
Second, we need to stop listening to the warmongers and the defense contractors who profit from conflict.
And third, we need to start telling the American people that we're in for a rough ride, and that the only way out is to focus on what matters: our people, our economy, and our future.
But here's the establishment doesn't want to hear any of this. They'd rather keep the machine running, even if it means driving the country off a cliff.
That's why they're so desperate to keep the narrative going that America is still the indispensable nation, that we can afford to police the world, that we can outspend and outlast our adversaries.
But the numbers don't lie.
The US is in decline, and if we don't change course, we're going to wake up one day and realize that we've lost the 21st century.
So here's my challenge: to stop listening to the pundits who tell you that everything's fine.
Stop believing the politicians who say we can afford to be the world's policeman.
And start demanding a foreign policy and a domestic policy that's based on reality, not fantasy. Because if we don't, we're going to learn the hard way that the world doesn't work the way we want it to. And by then, it'll be too late.